So, first step in our colorful galaxy with glowing stars is to lay down a wash of water. So I'm just going to get some clean water. As you can see, I went ahead and put masking tape along my paper to keep it taut and to keep it from buckling. This mimics a more traditional watercolor process called stretching. Stretching is a lot more involved, but this is kind of a cheater's version of it. And so I have my paper, I have water down on my paper, and now I'm just going to start putting colors in. So I decided beforehand what colors I wanted to do, and I chose a more like a cool palette. So I'm going to do some ultramarine blue with violet over here. And the trick with galaxies is to move quickly so that you can utilize the wetness on your paper. If you are not used to moving quickly, then I would recommend for sure starting with a small piece of paper. So I'm using like a size 4x6-ish, and that's a pretty good starting place. I would also recommend using masking tape around your paper so that you don't have to worry about keeping specific boundaries, because that is often the kiss of death with galaxies. When you have to be really careful to keep inside the lines of something, then you might, if you're not used to moving quickly, then you might go too slow, and then your paper will dry before you get a chance to lay down all of your colors. So I'm using some, as I said before, just some like cooler-ish colors here. I'm also adding some rosamarine here. And then I like to watch the colors blend together as I put them on the paper. See, like when I put this rosamarine here, it turns into more of like a traditional violet when it blends with the turquoise. That's pretty cool. The trick also, there are a lot of tricks with galaxies, as I just keep saying, the trick is here. It's also important. I think galaxies look really cool because of all of the blending colors, yes, but also because of the contrasting values. What that means is there are some really light lights and really dark darks. And so in order to, because I know that's one of the things that makes galaxies so cool, I want to keep some of my white space on purpose. So this space kind of stayed white, so I want to keep it white as much as possible for now. Same thing with over here. And I am doing that on purpose so that I can maintain some contrast as I get going. But this is only layer 1 of the galaxy, so I'll have lots of time to add even more contrast. Which leads me to the other trick to galaxies that I learned a little bit later in the game. Because watercolor is transparent, it has transparencies, you can layer it on top of, you can do multiple layers of watercolor, of color on top of each other, and they really just add to the colorful effect. And so galaxies really are more vibrant and deeper. You can see more complex layers of colors when you do actual multiple layers of colors. So like let this dry and then do a whole nother layer on top. My rule of thumb typically is to go for 3 layers. So I'm gonna let this dry and then we will paint our second layer. Okay, first layer is dry, and so for our second layer, we are going to do pretty much the same thing that we did with the first layer. Start with this wash of water. When you're doing the wash of water, you want to make sure it's light. You don't want to completely soak your paper, because otherwise it's going to be a lot more difficult to control where your color goes. In general, a rule of thumb with watercolor is the more water with the paint, the less control you have over it, which letting go of control is a big part of watercolor. But at the same time, if you have too much water and give it too much of the control, the watercolor is really just going to turn into a big pile of mush. I talked a lot about keeping white space, and that water, that sheet of, that layer of water kind of eliminated some of my white spots, but that's okay. So I'm going to just put down a lot of the same colors that I did, but I'm going to try to use even more pigmentation here. So that means making sure I'm picking up a lot of pigment and not so much a lot of water when I'm picking up the paint. And before I go on to my second layer, I am going to add the dark space element of my painting, which is some Payne's Gray. So for a long time when I did galaxies, I just used black, lamp black, but I had a friend who actually did go to art school tell me that traditionally watercolorists use Payne's Gray, or they mix their own black with their darkest green and their darkest red, and that's because black pigmentation sometimes washes out colors, like makes them look a little bit muddy. And I was definitely finding that when I was doing my galaxies, and so I switched to only using Payne's Gray for my like deep space effect, and I love it. So I highly recommend you experimenting with that if you've done galaxies before. But you can use black too, and black, I've painted some galaxies that I really loved using just black, so that's not to say black is completely out of the rotation. It just means that I'm having a lot of fun using this color. So when I add the black element for space, I like to make sure that it's blending with, it kind of like intrudes on the other colors, because the other colors really are supposed to be like clouds of color, right? It's clouds of gas, like a nebula is a cloud of gas, I think. And then the different elements in the nebula are supposed to look like colors. And so this cloud of gas is existing in space, and so we want to make sure that we get that cloudy effect. And one way that I do that is after placing down the pigment, washing it all off on my paintbrush using clean water and only like a damp brush. So I'm not adding too much more water back onto the paintbrush, but just like tapping along the cloudiness to help it blend a little more smoothly. So that about does it for my second layer. And now I'm going to let this dry and do my third and final layer. All right, so our second layer is dry, and now we're going to complete our galaxy by painting our third layer. And layer 3 is going to include more colors, and we're going to add the stars. And then once layer 3 is dry, one more layer of stars. Just so you have a little roadmap of what's ahead. So I'm adding more water, and then I'm going to add more colors, just like I did with the other layers. Okay, so we have our colors down, and now the final step is to add the stars. So we're going to take some white gouache. You can use regular white gouache, or you can use Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white. Sometimes I use that a lot, but just what I have on hand here. I'm going to get some white gouache, and for these glowing stars, you want the gouache to be really thick, so not super watery. So I'm just going to tap right on the wet space, and I'm going to do just a few of these stars around where I manually put them in, maybe like 3 of them. Wash off my paintbrush so it's just wet with water, and then kind of manually blend in. And I might have to wash off my paintbrush a few times on each star so that it doesn't get diluted with the color, because as my paintbrush is painting on the wet space, right, it's kind of diluting with the pigment that's already on there. So I want to make sure I don't completely make this star the not white anymore. And then I'm going to take more gouache and hold my paintbrush over the paper and just tap on some stars while the paper is still wet. And doing that is going to create even more of this kind of glowing effect. Some of these are going to dry as soon as I dry this, but having splattering on some stars while the paper is still wet is going to leave some even more glowing stars all around here. Okay, for the final step, we're going to take gouache once more on my paintbrush and splatter on stars while the painting is dry. So these wet on dry stars are going to be even more stark as a contrast against the space, in this painting, against the sky. And stars, in my opinion, are often really what bring a galaxy painting like this together. So you can see that we can still see some glowing stars underneath here, which I think looks super cool. But the stars on top just kind of give it that overall you're in space look. So there, I usually do that a few times. And now for the tape peel. Okay, thank you for joining me for this 10-minute tutorial where we learned how to paint a watercolor galaxy. I hope you had a good time, and I can't wait to see you next time.